Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, Parsimonious Piper here. It has been a couple of weeks, but today I am back together with,
Potter Piper.
and we are going to do the very next letter in C.S. Lewis Screwtape Letters. Well, I guess I'm reading, so let me put my pipe down and dive right in. My dear Wormwood, now that it is certain the German humans will bombard your patient's town and that his duties will keep him in the thick of the danger, we must consider our policy. Are we to aim at cowardice or at courage, with consequent pride, or at hatred of the Germans? Well, I'm afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. What would Attila have been without his courage, or Shylock without self denial as regards the flesh? But as we cannot supply these qualities ourselves, we can only use them as supplied by the enemy. And this means leaving him a kind of foothold in those men whom otherwise we have made most securely our own. A very unsatisfactory arrangement, but I trust we shall one day learn to do better. Hatred we can manage. The tension of human nerves during noise, danger, and fatigue makes them prone to any violent emotion. And it is only a question of guiding this susceptibility into the right channels. If conscience resists, muddle him. Let him say that he feels hatred not on his own behalf, but on that of the women and children, and that a Christian is told to forgive his own, not other people's enemies. In other words, let him consider himself sufficiently identified with the women and children to feel hatred on their behalf, but not sufficiently identified to regard their enemies as his own, and therefore proper objects of forgiveness. But hatred is best combined with fear. Cowardice alone of all the vices is purely painful, horrible to anticipate, horrible to feel, horrible to remember. Hatred has its pleasures. It is therefore often the compensation by which a frightened man reimburses himself for the miseries of fear. The more he fears, the more he will hate. And hatred is also a great anodyne for shame. To make a deep wound in this charity, you should therefore defeat his courage. Now, this is a ticklish business. We have made men proud of most vices, but not of cowardice. Whenever we have almost succeeded in doing so, the enemy permits a war or an earthquake or some other calamity, and at once courage becomes so obviously lovely and important, even in human eyes, that all our work is undone. And there is still at least one vice of which they feel genuine shame. The danger of inducing cowardice in our patients, therefore, is that we produce real self knowledge and self loathing, with consequent repentance and humility. And in fact, in the last war, thousands of humans, by discovering their own cowardice, discovered the whole moral world for the first time. In peace, we can make many of them ignore good and evil entirely. In danger, the issue is forced upon them in a guise to which even we cannot blind them. There is here a cruel dilemma before us. If we promoted justice and charity among men, we would be playing directly into the enemy's hands. But if we guide them to the opposite behavior, this sooner or later produces, for he permits it to produce, a war or a revolution, and the undisguised issue of cowardice or courage awakes thousands of men from moral stupor. This, indeed, is probably one of the enemy's motives for creating a dangerous world, a world in which moral issues really come to the point. He sees as well as you do that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. A chastity or honesty or mercy which yields to danger will be chaste or honest or merciful only on conditions. Pilate was merciful till it became risky. It is therefore possible to lose as much as we gain by making your man a coward. He may learn too much about himself. There is, of course, always the chance, not of chloroforming the shame, but of aggravating it and producing despair. This would be a great triumph. It would show that he had believed in and accepted the enemy's forgiveness of his other sins only because he himself did not fully feel their sinfulness. That in respect of the one vice which he really understands in its full depth of dishonor, he cannot seek nor credit the mercy. But I fear you have already let him get too far in the enemy's school, and he knows that despair is a greater sin than any of the sins which provoke it. As to the actual technique of temptations to cowardice, not much need be said. The main point is that precautions have a tendency to increase fear. The precautions publicly enjoined on your patient, however, soon become a matter of routine, and this effect disappears. What you must do is to keep running in his mind, side by side with the conscious intention of doing his duty, the vague idea of all sorts of things he can do or not do inside the framework of the duty, which seem to make him a little safer. Get his mind off the simple rule, I've got to stay here and do so and so, into a series of imaginary lifelines. If A happened, though I very much hope it won't, I could do B, and if the worst came to worst, I could always do C. Superstitions, if not recognized as such, can be awakened. The point is to keep him feeling that he has something other than the enemy and courage the enemy supplies to fall back on, so that what was intended to be a total commitment to duty becomes honeycombed all through with little unconscious reservations. By building up a series of imaginary expedients to prevent the worst coming to the worst, you may produce, at that level of his will which he is not aware of, a determination that the worst shall not come to the worst. Then, at the moment of real terror, rush it out into his nerves and muscles, and you may get the fatal act done before he knows what you're about. For remember, the act of cowardice is all that matters. The emotion of fear is in itself no sin, and though we enjoy it, it does us no good. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
Lewis in today's letter points out virtue. And as Lewis does, he challenges us to think a little differently than we may, as he has Screwtape wish that they could produce virtue, or at least some virtue within us, but they can't. But it follows how Screwtape, how they work, in that they always pervert. They always want to pervert some good, some truth. They want to pervert the truth. They want to pervert. They want to pervert virtue. And I find that very helpful to reflect upon, because it's so easy to go to the opposite, cowardice and so forth. And yet he wants to always start with some virtue. Now, thinking of virtue, one basic understanding can be virtue is forming good habits, and that's truth to that. As Christians, or I'd have to look at the different, would be more of a classical understanding, but more Christian understanding would be to seek is to seek the good, reject evil, and to do so by forming good habits. And you do so by seeking good. And so with that understanding of virtue, then I look to the cardinal virtues, which are the hinge virtues of then different lesser ones of patience and so forth. But and he mentions one. He refers to bravery. The words we would use would be more courage, or more of the I would say more of the traditional one, fortitude. But there's four cardinal virtues. Some of the words can change a little bit, but one that always stays the same is prudence. And then you might have courage. Some will maybe say bravery. He's using bravery. Fortitude. Those would be the same ones for that. then there's temperance, and then justice. And like I said, some of the words can change. And the reason I find that personally important is because he wants some virtue. And the reason he wants some is because then he can pervert one's strength, one's fortitude, one's bravery to desire to do the good. But if you're not working on all the virtues or virtue itself, then he can, that's where he can pervert it. Like he referenced Attila the Hun. You know, Attila the Hun had to have some bravery. He had to have strength. The question is, what are you going to do with that bravery? What are you going to do with that, with that strength? He points out the obvious, pitfalls of, for us as Screwtape, uh, as Wormwood would use, cowardice. And, cowardice being the opposite of fortitude, which means not to do the good because of fear of whatever I got to sacrifice. Whether that's, so cowardice means I'm going to cower, I'm going to not sacrifice, I'm not going to do the good because I don't want to sacrifice something of my physical nature. I don't want to get hurt. Um, Today, we might say more of, I don't want to sacrifice the esteem that I think I might have in someone else's life. So I will be a coward and not speak up or stand up for something that is a good for someone else or myself, and therefore compromising integrity or compromising, honesty. And so in this one, Screwtape, he challenges us, but he challenges Wormwood to say, yeah, cowardice is more fun for us, being them, but look to use a little bit of the virtue of fortitude or bravery to see where you can bring it, because maybe you can get them to justify hatred of other people, even though they're couching it in terms of I'm protecting my own, but against someone else. The four virtues, prudence. Prudence, we look at making a good decision, but it's making a good decision because I seek the good. For a Christian is I know who God is and I'm not. So prudence is recognizing that I make my decisions based on something greater than myself, the good, which is ultimately God. Justice is recognizing the fact that people are owed something. They're owed the good. They're owed something that's beyond myself. And I don't have the right to decide that. I have to work on prudence. Fortitude is the strength to carry it out, bravery, the strength to carry it out, being willing to sacrifice. I have to do the good in fortitude. I might have to sacrifice something of myself in strength and bravery. And temperance is the recognition of how to use my strength. I might not have to use it at some point. I might need to hold back, and other times not. And that's, all the virtues work together. But I love how Lewis challenges us to look at, he wants us to have a little virtue to see how can he pervert it for his good. And that's what I've appreciated in this letter.
Well, I'm going to latch on to two things, one that he said and one that you did. Talking about prudence, we often mistake that with uh, being overly cautious about things. Prudence is much more related to wisdom in decision making than, and we can become so prudent that all we're doing is being overly cautious and not making a decision, not taking an action when in fact we should, and we know we should. But well, as the old SNL sketch mocking one of our former presidents said, wouldn't be prudent. Um, the, this, like everything else, it can be exaggerated and taken too far. A little bit or the right amount, it is the right amount. Too little, too much, and we fall into the trap, Screwtape's trap for us. Now, to get onto the point that Lewis made in talking about bravery, or as you were saying, fortitude, being central to all of the other virtues. There's a very serious sense where that is really just so true. And you touched on this a little bit. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Screwtape gets to this just briefly at the very end of his letter. Fear isn't a sin. Fear is a natural emotion that humans feel when they're threatened in some way, whether it's physically or emotionally, or threatened with the loss of a job, that kind of thing. We naturally feel fear. The difference between cowardice and bravery isn't fear. Both people feel fear. The person who exhibits cowardice chooses not to do the right thing as a result of that fear, where the person who exhibits fortitude or bravery overcomes that fear and does the right thing despite being fearful about it. And the reason this is so important for the other virtues, just to give an example, in using today's culture, um, in the United States, we have an ongoing, very public, very ugly battle about putting biological men in women's sports, and more disturbingly, shower rooms, locker rooms, restrooms, etc. In the public schools, I keep hearing from Christians and Christian teachers, oh, well, there are still a lot of Christian teachers in the public schools. My question is, where are they? Because we're not hearing from them. They're not standing up. They're not speaking out. They're not walking off their jobs and making the point of that the reason that they're fighting against this is because of the insanity that is being forced on children right now. And I know that just saying that it somehow has become controversial. But if you don't have the courage, as we say, the courage of your convictions, then your convictions have no value. And this is where Screwtape is driving this. A little bit of courage is a good thing. But if you have too much courage, in his eyes, then you're actually going to have the fortitude to do the right thing. And he doesn't want that at any cost. He wants us to remain silent in the face of what is truly evil in the world. He wants us to sit back and do nothing. To be just brave enough to complain about it and maybe gripe about it with friends and so on, but not have the fortitude to risk um, in your workplace. Are you willing to risk losing your job to stand up to the bullies who are telling you that men and women are not just interchangeable in function, but in fact that a man can become a woman and vice versa simply by feeling that he or she is that particular day. Um, if we aren't willing to stand up and risk losing that job, then does our belief really mean anything? Does it have any value? And this is why that fortitude, bravery, as Lewis calls it, it's kind of the linchpin for the other virtues, because without it, we don't exercise any of those other virtues.
Exactly. And, you know, bringing up the fact that bravery and fortitude is not the absence of fear. And that's so true because in scripture, especially in the Old Testament, I can't remember chapter and verse, but it'll say, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And how true today, and I'm going to get to a point, it came to mind while you were talking about the modern day issues of, what do teachers do, many of us do, and when we're presented with falsehood and lies, and men, biological men, and but in women's sports and so forth. But that healthy fear is a beginning, it's not an end. But if you don't, but that healthy fear, a natural healthy fear, even a spiritual healthy fear, is not a cowering in the corner. It's recognizing that I am a part of something greater than myself, ultimately God's plan, and to have an utter respect for that, and to be able to have a healthy fear of my own soul, but also someone else's. And I might have to cause some problems in that respect to do so. And but I think of the healthy fear, and what came to mind about fortitude and courage is the present day, the trial with that former Marine Penny, that's happening in New York City, where you know, for all intents and purposes of what we've seen, he was a man that had no intention
Right.
of going to the train to kill somebody or just to drive the train. But here he saw danger of mental illness and so forth, that somebody could be attacked, and he wanted to stop the problem. But here is somebody that at least, and again, I don't know the man's heart. We can just look at the actions of afterwards and before. That here's a man that recognized that strength needed to be used to protect other people, but even to protect this guy from himself. And and I mean, I mean, the Screwtape could easily try to use this to pervert our thinking, and that say, well, that guy deserved to die. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that this guy, and it's not to go off in the rabbit hole of that, but the point, to make the point of bravery, is I don't, from what they've shown in the videos before, during, and after, that there was any intention to hurt this guy. It was to stop other people getting hurt, and for this guy himself. And you think about bravery in the sense of, because now, there's some people, obviously there's people on either side, but there's some people saying, if Penny, this guy, gets charged, who is going to want to be brave? Who's going to want to show fortitude to help other people?
Right.
And I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not saying I have an answer for this, because it's not the purpose of the video, but it brings to mind, I think, for many of us to look at fortitude and bravery, to be able to know how to use it. And so, yeah, I just thought it just came to mind. And for me, it challenges me to think about what is bravery and fortitude in my own life, to be able to stand up either physically, but also maybe spiritually, for someone, for the integrity of one's honor, one's good name. I think it's well done.
Well, and that actually, I think that's a great example, because here you have someone who didn't look at himself first and feared the consequences, but what's happening to him will make others hesitate, and allow evil to continue its course, sadly. And you will have people get hurt because people hold back and go, well, somebody needs to stop him, but I don't want to go to jail for stopping him. You know, um, we see this so much here in the corporate world in the United States, in a nod to Greg Tunnel. For those of us who aren't self-employed, and he will tell us all that we all should be, he may be right. Um, are we willing to push back against our corporate training departments when they come out with things that insist that we use language that we know to be false? to describe individuals. Um, you know, I'm one of those who very firmly believes that men and women cannot just change gender at will, and that even a physical surgical change does not change you from one to the other, and that calling someone by something that they have chosen rather than something that is a biological reality is a form of a lie, so I can't do that. Um, I've had that go round with my HR department. Uh, and I think it's important that more of us be willing to do that. I am by far not deep in the pockets to have a drawn out legal battle with my employer or anything like that, but um, it takes it takes a little bit of courage to be willing to do that. I told my wife I might not have a job tomorrow. Um, and but fortunately it didn't work out that way. I do think that in the long run, not always as immediately as happened with me, in the long run, I do think that God rewards those who stand up for truth. um, and we really need to be willing to do that. Uh, today's um, today's cultural war, as some folks like to call it, is not a cultural war. It is, in fact, a spiritual war. And we need to recognize it as such and be willing to fight it as such.
And I'm sure we're going to come to an end here, but like you mentioned, it's like each of us, especially if we work for someone else, but even self-employed, but it's hard. I can admit it's harder for us. Is where is our line?
Mm-hmm.
Where is the line of bravery and fortitude? Where's our line of integrity and of honesty? Because I mean, I live in New York State, and the joke is you either you work for the state, someone in your family works for the state, or your family, somebody works for the state of New York in some way, shape, or form. And me, I can say, is in church. I mean, because I have to answer to leaders and so forth, and you know, it's hard to say to someone else, "Well, you need to do this." To me, it always starts with us: is I need to know where my line is of bravery, of fortitude, and of integrity. Because, and if I'm going to move that line, I need to have an honest, and that's the problem, the honest conversation with God and another person who can be a mirror like God, to be able to say, am I moving that line out of cowardice, or am I moving that line because of temperance and fortitude? Because that's where the emotional dishonesty comes.
Mm-hmm.
And but that is the conversation that Screwtape does not want us to have, is even knowing, first, recognize you're moving your line. Secondly, why am I doing it? And those are hard conversations, but man, if we can have those with ourselves, with God, and one other person who we know will be honest with us, that's the track we want to be on.
It certainly is. That it certainly is. Well, folks, I hope that this discussion of cowardice and fortitude, and broader sense, the virtues in general, and being willing to exercise them, has brought a little bit of maybe thought about today's situation for you, and that while we look forward to next week's, you light something you like and enjoy this afternoon.